Oh,
Okay,
hi.
Hanno is here. Now it's time to start, Hello, Hanno.
Oh, sorry for
Okay,
delaying this.
so big welcome to everybody and nice to see you. Most of you I know. There's a Ja I don't know, but we will see.
Jerome is
And it's a great time. And of course, a special welcome to our speaker, who is Stanley Weiner, Canada Research Chair. I have to read this, Professor in Public Policy and is a emeritus and distinguished research professor at Carleton University in Ottawa. So, Stan, it's a great pleasure that you are here, and I will briefly introduce you. I don't want to have too many details, personal ones, but I have to mention that you earned your PhD in 1975 at Johns Hopkins, um, PhD in economics, and this is exactly the year when I got my doctorate from the University of München, actually in economics. So it's a coincidence. And there's another coincidence because you got the BA at Carleton University in 1971, and that is when I got my diploma at München in economics. So that's a parallel story. Now, Stanley Weiner had a lot of visiting professorships and fellowships all around the world. Fantastic list in Prague, Turin, Beijing, Tokyo, and repeatedly he visited München for a time. I think there were 5, 6 official visits, so to say, at the University of München. And that means just about 20 minutes from where I sit. I mean, if you take a bus and you're lucky, you're there in 20 minutes. Okay, now Stanley's field of research and most of his teaching is in the area of public choice and public economics. And there's a recent book, and this is actually the topic of today's talk, and it's Political Competition and the Study of Public Economics. It's published by Cambridge University Press, and it came out in October 2022. Now, this we will hear, will be presented by Stan. But maybe not everybody is familiar with the public choice and maybe with public economics. I will not talk about public economics, but a bit about public choice, because that might be useful for understanding the contents of the presentation. In public choice, to my understanding, you have, so to say, two approaches, two kind of perspectives. The one is that the scholar uses economic instruments like maximization, calculus, and so on, to approach political competition in a democracy. Competition between parties to gain government, or candidates to get presidency or something like that. But this is, so to say, this economic element of having a kind of oligopoly and so on. This is attributed to Anthony Downs most of the time, an economic theory of democracy, in a book of 1957, which was a doctoral dissertation. But of course, there were earlier forerunners, so to say, about this idea about competition for getting governance. And one is, of course, Schumpeter in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy of 1942. And there you find a winning government in a competition of getting votes, so in the voting process. Uh, you well, what became the Downsian model is actually already in a way written down in Harold Hotelling's paper, Stability and Competition in the Economic Journal of 1929. There you have the spatial model, and you have also an equilibrium, a discussion about the equilibrium and the deviation of the equilibrium if you have a kind of uncertainty and so on. But of course, you might also find it in Alexis de Tocqueville, in his Democracy in America, there is already something like competition mentioned in a democracy. Okay, this is, so to say, the technical aspect of public choice, using economic instruments for political competition in a democracy. But then there's another branch where this public economics comes in, and this is actually where you put this model of political competition into an economic environment where, it's about, well, there's public policy, deficit spending or so, or expenditures as such, and then this has an impact on employment or unemployment and inflation. And politicians might want to maximize their votes by organizing the economy such that they get this result they want. There's, of course, this political business cycle related to the name of Nordhaus, William Nordhaus, of 1975, I think. But there are a lot of papers or even books, before mentioning this kind of relationship. There's a funny book, actually, in German language, also in 1957, like Anthony Downs, by a person called, well, a person, by Fred O. Harding. Fred O. Harding is not known in economics for good reason, because he's a pseudonym. It's actually Philip Herder Dorneich who published his book under a different name because he was afraid his family might get angry if they hear that he writes that politicians are vote maximizers. So that for a while, this was not known, this book. And then in the German language, well, anyway, it didn't get very popular. But there is this kind of, it's a very nice book, and you find all the details of this kind of public choice related to public economics. Okay, so this is about the frame, but remember, the one is instrumental more or less, and the other one is really, we are dealing with the economy. Most of them, the details are then in a macro level. Okay, I want to stop here my introduction, and I'm looking very much forward to Stan's presentation, and then afterwards we might have a nice discussion. Stan, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me share my screen. Today I would like to introduce the Elements volume that Steve Ferris and I did recently on political competition and the study of public economics. It's a monograph or short book. I want to introduce the volume as a whole, but I'm certainly not going to present a summary of it. I want to look at, after a very brief introduction, to look at in some detail at a few of the issues that we raise that I hope will be of some interest. In the title is the study of public economics, so indicating that our purpose is to a considerable extent methodological. So, as you're aware, much of contemporary public economics is prescriptive or normative in character, being concerned with optimizing economic well-being embodied in a utilitarian social welfare function, subject to constraints that are intended to be strictly non-political in nature. There's, of course, an older but still well-used public finance tradition in which the emphasis is on striking a balance among sometimes competing objectives, including minimizing the full cost of taxation, horizontal and vertical equity, and tax administration, good tax administration. Normative public economics in these traditions is essentially a form of social or central planning. The competitive politics of a liberal democracy play no role in these approaches to policy analysis and policy design. The approach that we take in our Elements volume starts in a different place and asks different questions, though social well-being is also our primary concern. So we begin with, or hold throughout, to two essential premises. Throughout, we're cognizant of the fact that every policy in a liberal democracy, and we're talking here only about liberal democracies, every policy in a liberal democracy arises as the outcome of political competition among political parties for support from the electorate. That's the first premise. The second is more contentious. A full understanding of both private and public sectors in a liberal democracy must consider the relationship between political competition and resource use, whether our purpose is to understand actual policy choices, to judge the resulting outcomes from a normative perspective, or to formulate alternatives. And it's the latter part that is, of course, contentious. So the kinds of questions we address in the volume include the following, and this is really the only summary I'm going to present of it. How can political competition be understood, and how does it differ from its strictly economic counterpart? That's when you actually try to describe what competition is, it's actually rather interesting and difficult to do so. What are the strengths and weaknesses of electoral competition as a mechanism for the allocation of resources? What are the implications of the fact that policy proposals must always pass a feasibility test, a political feasibility test? How does competitive politics lead to tax structures as we observe them? Work that I've done a lot of with Walter Hedek. Why are tax systems so complicated? What does tax reform mean in this context? And what implications follow from all this for normative views about policy choice? And how can we measure the intensity of electoral competition? Why and how does it vary even in mature democracies? And what are the consequences of electoral competitiveness for economic welfare? So today, of course, I'm not going to go through all of that. I just want to consider some problems for the social planning tradition or central planning tradition in public finance that arises when we think about policy from a normative political economy perspective. By a normative political economy perspective, I mean that one that encompasses the three steps of welfare analysis of a market economy. So you begin with a choice of a standard of reference, in this case for a liberal democracy. I won't talk too much about that. It's difficult. An analysis, you then proceed to an analysis of conditions under which a competitive political equilibrium will result in such a nice result. An analog to the first theorem of welfare economics, in other words. And third, you engage in an analysis of what can go wrong and why. So those are the three steps of neoclassical welfare analysis, and those are the steps that we engage in the context of a consideration of public economics. This approach differs from constitutional contractarianism of the kind practiced by Jeff Brennan and James Buchanan and others, which is mainly focused on the principal agent problem for citizens, an issue which in the political economy approach will enter via the choice of the standard of reference suitable for judging a liberal democracy. The problems I want to consider today involve the following: redistribution and inefficiency in taxation, second best, and political feasibility. My discussion hinges primarily on some implications of thinking about public policy as part of a political economic equilibrium. So let's turn then to the first issue of efficient redistribution and the identification of inefficient policies. And here I'm going to begin with some modeling with voters and parties and so on. Voting is deterministic. A voter J will support the incumbent if the utility that the incumbent expects to get from the policies offered by the incumbent are greater than the utility they expect to get from the policies offered by the opposition, and they'll vote for the opposition otherwise. So voting is deterministic. But the competing parties in this approach see only a density function fj, a well-behaved density function, which as I've written it here, depends just on the difference in utilities. Other forms are possible of this density function. It's a well-behaved density function. So everybody has a positive probability of voting for either party, even though that probability might be very small in some cases. The parties maximize expected votes, subject to a set of constraints, including the government budget constraint and the structure of the private economy, which I'll just write as RS equals 0. Every party's expected vote is continuous and globally concave in the well-defined policy set. And so we have a Nash equilibrium in pure strategies, which has the usual form in equation 4. So we solve these set of first order conditions and we arrive at the Nash equilibrium. In this setup, there is an analog to the first theorem of welfare economics, which we refer to as a representation theorem. This is not original to us. You can go back to the work of Coughlin and Nietzsche and other people to see this. I call it a representation theorem for reasons that'll become clear in a moment. Well, because the equilibrium described above can be represented by the maximization of a synthetic political support function subject to the same constraints faced by the parties. So you can represent the equilibrium by solving the problem outlined in equation 5. This is a synthetic function where you reach into the Nash equilibrium, you take out from the Nash equilibrium the diF divs, the sensitivity of each voter to a change in their welfare at the Nash equilibrium. These are now just numbers. You put them into this function and you maximize that function. And you will come up with exactly these first order conditions, which have been solved for the Nash equilibrium. So a weighted sum of utilities, other forms of the density function will give different forms of this, but they'll all have the characteristic that a weighted sum of utilities is optimized. Now, it's important to understand that this function, this support function, as we call it, is not a social welfare function, because the weights are not chosen on the basis of some normative ideas. This is just a way of characterizing the equilibrium. Of course, we have to assume that that the support function is concave in the policy set, and if it's strictly concave, then the equilibrium will be unique. Tom Rutherford and I have actually calibrated a model like this to the US economy. Now to the problem for normative public economics, with this as a background. And I should point out, I guess, before proceeding, that the inefficiencies, if we can call them that, that are built into the standard of reference for a liberal democracy, about which I haven't talked, in order to constrain political authority, are not reflected in this representation theorem. I mean, as an analog, I would point out that transactions costs don't appear in the first theorem of welfare economics. That's a problem for welfare economics, and it's of course a problem for this approach to normative political economy, and it would be nice to build them in explicitly. It's very difficult to do so. But the problem is this. So let's simplify by assuming that S consists of a set of tax rates, one for each voter, levied on some tax base in order to finance a pure public good. Given the government revenue constraint into which economic structure has been substituted, the first order conditions characterizing the equilibrium are given by 6 and 7. And so we have one for each tax rate and one determining the size of the public good. And these will look, if you're familiar with normative public economics, these look very familiar, except this is characterizing a political equilibrium, not a social welfare optimum, although in this world, the two are the same. In this well-functioning polity, redistribution is conducted as efficiently as possible. Suppose, I mean, you can see that clearly if you suppose that the weights are equal. There's no reason why they should be equal. We don't require everybody to vote. There's no reason why everybody's political influence should be equal in a liberal democracy. But suppose the weights are equal. Then if you look at the condition 6, we see that marginal welfare costs per unit of revenue are equalized. Thus, the welfare cost of financing a public sector given size is minimized. Okay. More generally, of course, if influence is distributed unequally, welfare losses for different sources may vary significantly as parties trade off support from various groups of voters, even though the equilibrium lies on the Pareto frontier. Of course, what we mean by the Pareto frontier is going to depend on exactly how we specify the standard of reference, but leaving that, we'll leave that aside. So we have an efficient tax structure in the usual sense used in public economics. So the problem is that of distinguishing between redistribution and inefficient tax design. In a well-functioning electoral system, the usual approach to detecting inefficiency in tax systems is to look for inequalities in welfare costs across tax instruments. But in this world, and I would say the world as we live in it, as we observe it, such an approach to looking for inefficiencies will associate all of the observed inequalities with bad tax design, even though competition between parties fully incorporates all relevant welfare losses. So we don't have to think that political equilibria are fully efficient to agree that some parts of the inequalities and unweighted welfare costs are due to redistribution that's being conducted at minimal cost in the pursuit of electoral support. But which parts? Which parts? And this leads to a challenge for, of course, a challenge for normative political economy of the sort that we're thinking about, of relating specific features of the political process to particular inefficiencies in policy structures. And I think that's probably the single most important challenge for normative political economy in the coming years. So this is the first problem. If you take politics and political competition seriously, then it's very difficult to distinguish between inefficiency and redistribution. And the standard approach to looking at inequalities and unweighted welfare losses simply won't tell you much. Second problem, second best theory. So just to cite Robin, who actually was one of the editors of the Elements series in which this book appears. So I'm not criticizing Robin here. The second best problem arises either from immutable distortions in a subset of markets or from limitations in the policy instruments available to government. And so much of normative public economics over the last few decades has been concerned with this second best problem. The challenge, which is not a new one, stems from the fact that in a political economy setting, the initial constraints on policy instruments are the outcome of prior political optimization. And this is an observation that was made 40 years ago by Eddie West, my late colleague Eddie West, and one of his students, Mike McKee. Let me give you an example. Suppose we have a distortion due to a monopoly in one sector. Okay? Consider then a government subsidy, the second best instrument in this case, given to a monopolist competitor in the same or in a closely related sector in order to minimize the consequences of the distortion between price and marginal cost and the monopolist's choices, thereby offsetting the consequences of the monopoly for economic welfare. The problem is that the second distortion due to the subsidy is unlikely to increase efficiency overall. The reason is that the granting of the monopoly represents an equilibrium result of prior political choices, and as such reflects the first best solution given the operation of the political process in which production and inefficiency is one of the many costs of allocating property rights. So under the pressure of electoral competition, the second best policy, if it somehow were introduced, and of course it's not clear how it would be, this second best policy will elicit further reaction to restore the advantage originally conferred. Moreover, the adjustments arising in the economy in response to this quote unquote improvement would represent movements away from a previously optimal solution. This is again a problem that arises because public policy as it exists is a political equilibrium. Well, do information problems facing governments constitute a special case? So much of the second best analysis has moved on from the kind of monopoly example I gave you to think about second best policies in the context of overcoming incentive compatibility constraints that arise from asymmetric information concerning the ability of individuals to lower their tax liabilities. So you don't know who is who, you can't control people, you can't make them worse off than they would be given their opportunity set. And these are second best policies if the source of the asymmetry is assumed to be out of reach of the policymaker. But the mechanisms the government's allowed to use to acquire information derived from a political equilibrium in which the community has decided how much personal privacy is permissible. The McKee-West critique applied in this situation, they didn't do that, but if you applied it in this situation, it suggests that the policies to get around the asymmetric information problem may challenge the implied social contract concerning knowledge and control of private behavior in a liberal economy. This is another issue that hasn't been well studied. So the incentive compatibility constraints are themselves endogenous, depending on what we allow the government to know about us. So that's the second issue, the problem of second best. Finally, and at a bit more length, the issue of political feasibility. And this consideration of this issue, which social planning explicitly refrains from considering, leads to what Ron and my late friends Bob Youngs has identified as tectonic policy, and to the role of Schumpeterian political competition. And Manfred mentioned Schumpeter, who I think is at least as important as in political economy as Downs. So two examples will illustrate the general problem of policy design that arises when feasibility is ignored. The first has to do with the rejection in the early 80s under Ronald Reagan of a broad-based expenditure tax in favor of a Shands-Hague-Simons broad-based income tax. And the second concerns the Merely Review's advocacy of reduced corporate taxation, and I should add more, and coupled with more reliance on wealth transfer taxation. And so, as before, here we're trying to connect directly with the kinds of issues that normative public economics tackles, and justifiably tackles. So some details about these cases. So as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in the early 80s, Charles McClure was charged with drawing up a US tax reform known as Treasury 1. He proposed a broad-based income tax despite economic theory, which at the time had swung heavily in favor of a broad-based expenditure tax. And he wrote about what happened with George Ludrow in a paper in the 2007. The rationale for this proposal, they say, was that McClure was sure that one component of the expenditure tax would never be accepted by President Reagan. And as a result, the outcome would be worse than if the Treasury proposed a broad-based income tax. The component he was sure would be missing was the taxation of wealth transfers, which is required to preserve equity over longer periods, as well as tax neutrality when an expenditure tax replaces a personal income tax. I mean, if you don't tax wealth transfers, the rich, of course, just pass it on and it's never taxed at all. What about the Merely's advocacy of reduced corporate taxation? In the Merely's review, published in 2010, 2011, capital income is heavily sheltered from direct taxation for efficiency reasons, and wealth transfer taxes are advocated as a means of maintaining or restoring overall progressivity. Inheritance taxes are also recommended as a way to improve equality of opportunity. The problem facing those who want to put more emphasis on wealth transfer taxation is that this form of taxation in the mature democracies has been declining for several decades. Perhaps because of opposition from aging electorates who want to pass on their hard-earned wealth to their children. Perhaps of successful lobbying by moneyed interests. And I've tried to model this with Profeta and Scambracetti a few years ago. Whatever the reason, if the decline in wealth transfer taxation is regarded as a political constraint to be factored into tax design, which I think it should be, the proposals in the Merely's review might have looked somewhat different. Perhaps a Nordic-style dual income tax involving separate rates of taxation on capital income and labor income would have been a preferred alternative. What's the takeaway here? Well, in both cases, the advocacy of a multi-part social plan was quite likely and predictably likely to result in only part of the overall proposal being accepted. producing an outcome that is no longer optimal when judged from the original standpoint. That's an important point. So on their own grounds, these plans will produce an outcome that isn't optimal or desirable. That's just the logic of optimization, of course. But we can go a bit further here and formalize a little bit. I'm sure one could do even more than this. And this gets us into, leads us into the identification of tectonic policy and into Schumpeterian political competition. And that's where I'll end my remarks. So let's consider a policy in period 1 that affects welfare now and in the future. Suppose also that changes in policy today affect the weight of some groups in a second period or in the future by altering income distribution or through some other route. Given, let's ignore discounting and the structure, the constraints of that might apply, and just start with a given political support or expected vote function of the following, of the kind given in 8, in which the policy S1 affects the weights in the future. So in the second term on the right, we have theta S1 times V2 of S1. Well, in that case, the governing party competing for support will adopt S1 only if the right-hand side of 9 is positive. Or of course, they'll try to optimize by maximizing this, but they certainly wouldn't undertake S1 if 9 wasn't satisfied. This, of course, differs from benefit cost analysis. The benefit cost analyst doesn't consider either the heterogeneity of political influence or the impact of policy on the political equilibrium. That analyst considers only 10. That's the standard analysis, where again, we're ignoring discounting and the constraints and so on, but that's not important. Of course, the political strategists are interested in the economist's evaluation of economic consequences, the terms in the VDS, and they're going to fill in their own estimates of the theta and the d theta ds's. So we can go even further than that, because parties also recognize that feasibility, political influence, and the feasibility of policy, the feasibility and political desirability of policy evolves. For example, demographic aging alters the relative influence in young and old and changes the profitability of programs directed at these groups. And in fact, Peter Lindert has written another elements volume that addresses exactly this point. He thinks that the current social welfare states are greatly threatened by the aging of the populations. It's going to make it difficult to provide social welfare programs for younger people. Sometimes, of course, policy, or sometimes or even usually, policy is designed to proactively alter future behavior. I can think of several examples. Thatcher's policy of selling public housing to their occupants was intended to change the voting behavior of new homeowners in a conservative direction. This is an example that Bob Young used in his paper. Immigration policy, of course, is a way to alter the long-term configuration of political support, and to do so explicitly and with foreknowledge. There's lots of work along those lines. And finally, I guess you might even think of the European Union as a long-term project aimed at creating shifts in attitudes towards political integration across member states. So these are all tectonic policies. they emerge from a form of political competition, one of the many forms that we discuss in the book. In this case, a form that's analogous to Schumpeterian creative destruction in a market. So this is these are the three problems. The problem of distinguishing between efficiency and redistribution, the problem of knowing what is the second best, if indeed there is such a thing, and lastly, the problems that arise if you ignore the fact, which we've referred to as political feasibility. You ignore the fact that public policy is part of the political equilibrium and is only feasible if it's supportable as a political equilibrium. Some last thoughts for today. I think it's interesting and challenging to think about normative political economy as an alternative to social planning, as a way of proceeding in the study of public policy. And finally, I end with this thought: the outcome of elections in a liberal democracy can never be known with certainty. Indeed, that's one of the preconditions for a liberal democracy, along with the irreversibility of the elections and the continuation without end of these elections. So what is compatible with an electoral equilibrium can only be known up to a probability distribution over alternatives. You never know for sure what's going to happen. Moreover, policy choices and the policy process itself can be altered to some extent, although only with costly effort, through democratic participation and institutional reform. So there's always room for, and there always will be room for discussion and debate. And that's what I have to present to you today.
Well, thank you very much, Stan. It was tough food for a while, you know, these equations. It's also, I mean, the problem was that I had difficulties to read a bit. But what I understood was, you know, it was a great presentation. Thank you. Yeah, here we are. Any questions, comments? I can see Ron. Yeah, Nick Bagent, please go ahead. No, you have to. Nick, we cannot hear you. We cannot
Can you hear me now?
you.
Yes.
You got me now. Yeah.
Now
So
it's good.
yeah, okay. I agree. That was a great presentation. I've always thought that the second best theorem is one of the most wonderful theorems in economics. And I had thought it was being ignored far too much these days. And I'm glad to hear that it's alive and well. I'll have to read your book. The couple of things towards the end. If you see the house I'm in now, if you look behind me, you can see a bit of it. I bought this from Thatcher's government, and it hadn't changed my. I haven't. It's in East London. It used to be a council house. I haven't changed my preferences since those.
Well, it may not have been successful. I mean, but she certainly tried
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's certainly true. Yeah,
She tried hard, and I mean, the logic of it is pretty compelling.
yeah, yeah.
Right? You give people an interest in their property, they behave differently than if they don't own it.
Yes, and who knows, the recent swing from Labour votes to Conservative votes may plausibly have a lot of reasons, but the fact is that a lot of those voters would now be living in houses they owned, which they only own by virtue of Thatcher's move.
Right.
Anyway, on one of the slides towards the end, you mentioned immigration as a way to change the distribution of political preferences, right? Yeah. So I just wanted to draw attention to the possibility that there may be a cost to that in the sense of emigration too. I think in several countries, certainly in Britain, we're forever hearing that if this or that party do this, all sorts of rich and possibly able people will emigrate. Indeed, some people, not myself, but some people seem to live in fear that our current Prime Minister might emigrate, being very rich and it would be able to do that. So there's some kind of net migration that might be the relevant variable there. Okay,
Right.
thank you for your talk.
The I found it interesting that one could see in this kind of situation the Schumpeterian creative destruction. I mean, the constant attempts by parties to shift the ground from underneath the opposition. And that kind of competition, I don't think, has been well studied in political economy. Of course, it makes it very difficult to, in the context of the normative political thinking that we introduce or try to follow up on, makes it very difficult to figure out what policies are feasible. I guess parties can try to create the feasibility for the policies they'd like to see, and they certainly try to do that. From a public economics point of view, it makes it very difficult to figure out what's efficient, what's best, what's in some sense.
Okay, just to be clear on that last point, the concept of feasibility is not just resource technology feasibility, but incentive compatibility as well. Is that
It's
right?
compatibility with the political equilibrium. You will never observe a policy that's not compatible with the political equilibrium.
Okay, thank you.
Not in the world that I see around me.
Thanks.
And right.
Any
So
other questions?
who exactly is public economics talking to?
I think Ron has a question, or was it
Yeah.
Signal?
Yeah. Thanks, Stan. That was a very good presentation. And so basically, my understanding is that it's a probabilistic voting model.
Yeah, the one that we're using.
And then, so everything then, so that you can't say anything against that in terms of efficiency. The only thing you can quibble about is the weights, which happen to be chosen in a particular way by probabilistic voting, namely those who are most sensitive to changes in the policies, they get more weight. But other than that,
Not
it's efficient.
Not exactly. I mean, I didn't today, but you can go further and ask what happens if, for example, voters are subject to various biases, the kind that are often discussed. And in that case, and if you build that into voting behavior, For example, by putting something in the density function that appears outside of the indirect utilities and use the representation theorem, you see clearly that the equilibrium is not efficient. It's not a social welfare optimum.
Mhm.
So the idea would be that if you want to study, the idea is that in the third step, which I didn't talk about today, about why things are not, why the world is not the best place we could ever live in. You would study that in the normative political economy approach that we're advocating. You'd study that by explicitly building into your equilibrium model a reason why the outcome would not be as it would be in the perfectly functioning, perfectly competitive polity. And so you'd study it like that, just like people do study inefficiency of market equilibrium. That's not the way public economics proceeds. Right?
No,
But that's the way I think you should study it.
but from the positive, not the normative point of view. From the positive point
From
of
the normative point of view.
No, I know, but from the positive point of view, the probabilistic voting model tells you that you're going to get a policy that maximizes that function.
If there are no problems of the sort I just mentioned.
And so that, where do they enter? They don't enter the weights.
Well, for example, no. So if you think about the density function that I specified, it was just a function of the difference in indirect utilities from incumbent and opposition parties. Okay. If you think about biases that voters have, they don't know exactly what's happening. They're subject to, just all sorts of problems that are well studied in the literature. That amounts to saying, in many cases, that in addition to the utility from policy that people get as arguments in the density function, there is separately other elements, information costs, whatever creates the biases, etc. And if you go through the steps I went through with that density function, then the representation theorem tells you that it's not a weighted sum of utilities that gets optimized. It's a weighted sum of utilities plus something else, right? And that way of proceeding in normative public economics is quite different than social planning. It's more in tune with neoclassical welfare economics.
Yeah, so in other words, you're going beyond the probabilistic voting model as a representation of as a positive description of the world,
Yeah,
not a normative.
the interesting challenge is to use it normatively. Yeah. Now, if you don't like the probabilistic approach, which I find kind of intuitive and reasonable, but
No, I like it.
Yeah, if you don't like it, use some other equilibrium modeling, right? And describe a subject to some standard of reference. Describe a world that generates that standard, and then proceed from there. So presumably there are other ways of thinking about the establishment of an electoral equilibrium besides probabilistic voting. I mean, I think that's the best one, but who am I to prejudge that? And you could still proceed in essentially the same way: standard of reference, a first theorem, an analysis of why that theorem doesn't hold, and then of course the final step is, well, then what? And that's quite difficult. I think there is no obvious answer to that. I mean, if you want to change something, you have to get involved. And I mean, the traditional approach is you just speak truth to power, right? But they're not interested in the economist's advice by itself, as we know. There are political strategists who are involved. That's kind of that's the sort of the flavor of the thinking in the monograph.
Now, just to understand the discussion you just had, I think, that was, well, in the beginning, Stan, you presented the Nash equilibria conditions, and that was your political market, so to say. And then the structure was, when you put it together, it looked like a welfare function. It looked like a welfare function.
It looks like it isn't.
It was not. It was just, I'm very primitive on that, really. But that you said, well, this is the condition such that what you get, because with the positive, you would say, without that, the politics does not function. So whatever you do, it has to satisfy these conditions. And then you find out, that there are, it's the result of that is not efficient. Or it might be not efficient, and it might be inefficient because of redistribution, for instance, or it needs a redistribution. Is that the story, so to say, the fundamental one?
Or it might be difficult to tell because the standard in the standard of reference, I didn't talk about this much, but in the standard of reference, you need to have all the constraints that make a liberal democracy sustainable. And some of these constraints make public policy quite bad. I mean, or what looks like it's making it quite bad. You have to take the lowest bid. You have to hire and fire on merit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are all sorts of constraints on the operation of legislatures that make majority rules stable. I mean, this thing can break down for all sorts of reasons. Global concavity.
This was in your R, huh? That was in your R, these constraints. Yeah.
But I'd like to say one thing here. If you don't have an equilibrium, I don't understand how you can think about the deviation of public policy from some ideal. If anything can happen and does, I don't know what it means to talk about optimizing social well.
Yeah, but of course you could have a dynamic model. You're out of equilibrium. You have a real process, so to say, looking at this outcome of the economy of the society, and then you have a hypothetical one. You said this is how it should be, and then of course you have to have a weighted measure for this difference.
Yeah, but your equilibrium.
Then you have discounting and all this mess.
True. But your equilibrium analysis is the dynamic one, the dynamic model.
Really?
You have some idea of where everything is going. If you have no such idea, then I think you're dead in the water.
Yeah, but it doesn't show you the losses in time, so to say. What you see is inefficiency and so on, but you don't see the losses,
Right. I mean, I'm sure that's an interesting model to work with, but I don't see that as a fundamental objection. It's just
no. It's just an alternative, and it's a very difficult alternative. I think we cannot manage it because then you have also the problem, how to evaluate time. I mean, and then if you think about voters, then you have, of course, different time aspects. Some have short-lived, the other long-lived, and all kind of things.
How would you how would you propose a public policy in such a world?
I leave it to you.
They don't ask me. once I
No,
started
no, well,
consulting,
yeah,
I
yeah.
still stopped doing consulting.
Yeah, but I think, when you look, well, let's say if I look at the German public policy, I don't think they are far out of the equilibrium with respect to possible voting outcomes, with respect to economic targets, and so on. But they live with it, they have to do it, but they are not in equilibrium.
Well, it's a moving equilibrium. It's a sequence of equilibria.
Yeah, yeah.
You can think of it.
Then we come close to what I think, that you try to do a process,
Right.
Okay. Okay. No. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Um, any other comment? Okay. Then,
Actually, I would say one more thing, if I could.
Yeah,
I
of
could
course
add
you
one
can.
more comment.
Yeah, yeah. Go on, Ron.
So I suppose,
Mhm.
I mean, I think you could do more with just the straight probabilistic voting model. So for example, populism. Suppose you wanted to
Mhm.
say, what does that do to the result? So it's really just, you could model that just as the change in the weights,
Mhm.
whereby, a party, the weights get put on a certain group of individuals that called the people, and the remainder get zero weight.
Mhm.
And so you get policies that come out of that, where you give certain groups, minorities, zero weight, and the others excessive weights. You get policies that look like populist policies.
Right.
So you could do a lot with
Right.
just a straight probabilistic voting model in terms of accounting for the kinds of things that happen in the contemporary world, just by saying that what this party is doing is changing the weights, weighting the population differently, and hoping to get elected that way.
Or capitalizing on weights that have changed for some reasons.
Yeah.
But just
without
note that
introducing any other element of corruption. Like, I don't know how you'd model corruption in that way, but it seems to me, a lot of problems you can model just with the
yeah, you can
probabilistic voting model.
put corruption in there. One thing though that you can't do is give some significant group a zero weight, because then the support functions or the expected vote functions are not globally concave, and then I mean, you need two things for Nash equilibrium, right? You need continuity and you need concavity. So the concavity over the whole policy space may not hold. I mean, Dan Usher has pointed this out. Gebhard Kirschkastner pointed this out. And so the equilibrium can't be established. So I mean, if you have pro-lifers and pro-choicers debating with each other, that the one group is never going to vote for policies that the other one wants. And this is one of the reasons, maybe the fundamental, and then you never have a majority rule equilibrium. This is a reason why I think these policies with respect to things like abortion are kept out of the legislature, and they're dealt with in the courts. I mean, in Canada, of course, I don't know if you know this, generally, there is no law about abortion in Canada. None. And the reason being that, and nobody was going to introduce the issue in the House of Commons, because there's no way to reach any agreement. I mean, this evolved from juries that simply refused to convict a doctor who admitted to and knowingly did do abortion. Yes, you did it. No, you're not guilty. And the government could never convict him, and the law just disappeared. and no one wants to bring it back. So I think the fundamental reason is that, I mean, you can relate to the lack of concavity of the support function. That doesn't sound very profound, but I mean, technically, that's what would happen. There's lots of reasons why majority equilibria don't exist, and I mean, that have been discussed in the literature over the years. We do a bit of it in the book, but just a bit. Polarization is bad. If it leads to some groups never being considered at all. So I would guess that populism involves kind of a shift towards one end, but not a complete neglect of the other.
Okay, Shanti, please go ahead.
Okay, so you're suggesting the kind of model that you're suggesting is about requires trade-off, compromise.
Right.
Presumably that implies that societies where religion is terribly important cannot be democratic in that sense, because then compromise is impossible. Because if religion is to mean something, it has to have a doctrine. And if you compromise on the doctrine, as Schumpeter says, this is, of course, you're degrading your belief.
Right.
So presumably only societies which are secular, non-religious, can begin to think about the kind of democracy that you are trying to study.
Yeah. I would guess there's a lot written about this, about the coevolution of democracy and secularism. Yeah, I think that's a profound insight. Theocracies are not democratic. Ron, do you know of any democratic theocracies? Ron studied.
They call themselves democracies sometimes.
Well, Israel has aspects of a democratic theocracy.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a troubled, their political system is very troubled. Of course, it's proportional. And the deals that are made, they establish an equilibrium after the election, not before. And the one that's emerging doesn't look very palatable to me.
No, you have to read there's an article. The new set of deals is spectacular.
The new what?
The new set of deals that are being made
Uh-huh.
in Israel right now is spectacular. Is a spectacular bit of.
Yeah.
Basically, in order to accommodate the crazy people that are now have power, he's given them all the same power.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's let them all fight with each other, and that's what they'll do that, and nothing will happen. It was very clever.
Wow.
I can't stand him, but it's what he did is very clever in this case. So we'll see what happens, but it's the closest example I can think of.
Yeah. Well, they've had 5 elections in what? A few years. I mean, it's not stable. I mean,
No.
Okay.
Technical problem. May I just go back to equation 6, or is it too
equation
late
6.
to do that? Equation 6.
Let me just find that in my notes. Okay, that's the tax structure in a functioning polity. Right. Okay.
Right. The individuals pay tax and they get the public good, G. Is that correct?
Correct.
Where does their income come from? Does it come from the production of the public good or something else?
Well, it's also all of that is suppressed here. It's all embedded in the constraint. I mean, it's a very stylized representation of what happens, of the kind that you'll often find in public economics textbooks.
Right, I know. So what you're saying is that in your model, it is possible for some of these individuals who pay taxes on their income to have received the income through the production of the public good itself.
Well, think about highways. I mean, if you're taxing road use and you build highways, you get more goods.
Yeah.
So the G appears in there. It's just a way of adding a little bit of generality. But take the G out, nothing of the argument changes really. This is just a standard representation that's used in public economics textbooks, which is why I did it that way. Because I want to connect. My intention is to try to connect with people who do public economics in a normative way, and that's part of it. This model is part of it. These equations 6 and 7 look very much like a standard social welfare optimization problem with taxation and public goods, except that here it's a characterization of an equilibrium. That's chosen. That model's chosen purposefully. You can complicate the tax structure, as I've done on other occasions, all sorts of ways, and later further on in the book, but also in my work with George Warscott and Walter Heddick and others, we've looked at very complex tax systems in this kind of context. The tax structure becomes a sorting equilibrium, where different people are assigned to certain categories in the face of transactions costs. And you get a tax structure out of it as opposed to a set of tax rates, which is the case in this model.
Okay. Any other question? Yeah, then thank you very much, Stan, for your presentation. Thank you for the questions and the discussion. And we see you next Monday again. I hope so.
Thank you for
wish you a
having me.
nice evening.
And I look
Okay.
forward to getting together with everyone in person at some point.
Okay.